I24 News. The president of Turkey is denouncing U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton and is refusing to meet with him. Bolton says U.S. troops will not withdraw from Syria unless Turkey promises not to attack the Kurds, a U.S. ally.
It is not possible for us to accept and stomach the message Bolton gave from Israel.
President Trump is delivering a nationwide television address this evening and urging the public to support his demands for a southern border wall. A dispute over funding has kept much of the government closed for 18 days.
And this was a chaotic day at London's Heathrow Airport, the busiest in Europe. Drone sightings prompted a 2-hour ground halt, delaying hundreds of flights and angering thousands of passengers.
From the I24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Shuster and Tal Heinrich.
President Trump is taking his case for a southern border wall to a nationwide television audience. This evening, the president is asking the public to help him pressure Democrats to support his demands.
Mr. Trump's refusal to sign a government funding bill that does not include money for the wall has kept 8 U.S. government agencies shut down for 18 days now. We will have more ahead.
But we want to begin this evening with a growing spat between the United States and Turkey, two NATO allies who are increasingly divided over the future of Syria. Turkish President Erdogan lashed out on this day at U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton.
On Monday, while in Israel, Bolton announced new conditions for the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria. Bolton said no troops will leave northern Syria until Turkey agreed not to attack the Syrian Kurds. The United States has backed the Kurdish militia in their fight against the Islamic State in Syria.
But Turkey considers the Kurdish militia terrorists. And last month, President Trump announced that all U.S. troops would be immediately withdrawn from Syria with no conditions. Erdogan says he is ignoring Bolton's new conditions and is preparing for a Turkish military offensive in Syria against the Kurds.
Regarding this matter, Bolton has made a serious mistake, and whoever thinks like this has also made a mistake. It is not possible for us to make compromises on this point. Those who are part of the terror corridor in Syria will receive the necessary lesson.
For more, let's bring in senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson. Nina, John Bolton was expected to meet with President Erdogan of Turkey, but Bolton was snubbed?
It was a snub, Tal. He was meant to meet with President Erdogan. That meeting and also a joint press conference was abruptly cancelled in Ankara today. Quite an obvious move by President Erdogan. John Bolton, as we speak, on his way back to Washington now. And President Erdogan, it seems, was speaking to everybody except John Bolton. Not only did he address Parliament, you saw a clip of that comment there that he made addressing Parliament earlier today, but he also wrote a very detailed op-ed in the New York Times yesterday. And essentially that op-ed laid out Turkey's strategy going forward in Syria.
And Nina, what exactly is that strategy based on the op-ed in the New York Times?
Well, the thing that struck me the most, David, was for the first time I've heard Erdogan state unequivocally that Turkey doesn't have any beef with Syrian Kurds as a population. Instead, he was making the case that some of the YPG militia, and let's not forget that's the Kurdish fighters who have fought side by side with the United States and their allies in the fight against ISIS within Syria. Erdogan made the point that some of these young fighters were perhaps conscripted forcibly in the fog of war. And he said Turkey would make allowances for that. He also talked about how the YPG had been recruiting, he says, child soldiers, and that Turkey would make every effort to try and reunite those children with their parents. So Turkey kind of taking the moral high ground, but at the same time as they are planning some kind of offensive into Manbij, that essential area in northern Syria, right on the Turkish border, only 20 miles from the Turkish border, to give this some context. And the people of Manbij are waiting as we speak to see what their fate will be.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, reporting from Washington. Nina, thank you.
To discuss it further, let's bring in Aykan Erdemir, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a former member of the Turkish parliament. Aykan, Erdogan is very angry over Bolton's remarks, saying that the U.S. would only pull out of Syria if it gets guarantees that Turkey would not attack the Kurds. Does it necessarily mean that maybe President Erdogan had a different impression following his phone conversation with President Trump?
No, I think President Erdogan is playing a divide and conquer game here. He wants to make sure that he maintains cordial relations with President Trump, so he avoids targeting him head-on. Instead, he goes after his closest colleagues, his advisors, including Bolton. When we take a look at the Turkish media yesterday and today, we have seen strong anti-American messaging. We have seen direct targeting of the closest aides of President Trump, but then arguing that those aides have been carrying out a soft coup, that is, that they are undermining Trump. And when we take a look at the New York Times op-ed that Erdogan penned, we see a very constructive, very kind of positive messaging Erdogan using to address the American public. So clearly there are very calculated different messages coming from Erdogan in Ankara.
It may be a very calculated strategy from Erdogan, but even President Trump has been pulling back from his comments about withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. So it does seem like John Bolton does speak for the Trump administration in terms of not withdrawing very quickly and insisting that the Kurds be protected from Turkey.
That is true, but President Erdogan has an election to win in March, the local elections. And in the run-up to elections, he really needs the rally around the flag effect of a cross-border campaign against Syrian Kurdish YPG forces. And what's better than, anti-Kurdish rhetoric, anti-American rhetoric, and also coupled with some anti-Israeli rhetoric in the Turkish media today than to win votes in Turkey. So Erdogan, I think, will continue this line of reasoning, arguing that Trump is on the same page with him, but it's these advisors around Trump who are undermining Trump through a soft coup, and that they are actually pursuing not only an anti-Trump agenda, but also a Zionist agenda on behalf of Israel. So this is what we're reading from the Turkish press. It's a completely different messaging than the very constructive messaging that we see in the New York Times op-ed. And Erdogan is, of course, the mastermind of propaganda and multiple messaging targeting different audiences, and this is just another repeat of the same strategy.
Aykan, we see the Kurds, we look at them as U.S. allies who helped in the fight against the Islamic State. But can you explain Erdogan's point of view? Why does he consider the YPG or the Kurds, the PKK in Turkey, such a national threat?
Now, this is not only Erdogan's thinking. When we take a look at polls, a wide segment of the Turkish electorate sees the YPG as an existential threat, as one and the same with the designated organization PKK. And hence, Erdogan, as a smart politician, is basically riding this nationalist backlash against the YPG. Yes, there were moments in 2015 when the Turkish state itself approached YPG in a very pragmatic manner. There was at least one military operation carried out in coordination with the YPG to basically relocate the Süleyman Shah Shrine from Syria to near Turkish border. But 2015 was a very different time period when there was still the final months of the Turkey's Kurdish peace process. Now Turkey is very far away from that moment. There is a very strong zealous nationalist sentiment and a zeal to go after Syrian Kurdish fighters.
Given that, I want to stop you just for a sec, because
using this opportunity.
And we only have about 30 seconds left with you, but given that nationalism, do you think that Erdogan will go ahead and roll troops into Syria to attack the Kurds before these elections in March?
Given the dismal state of the Turkish economy, I think a cross-border military operation is Erdogan's only hope of rallying voters around the flag. So I think it would be a pretty probable expectation.
Aykan Erdemir, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, is also a former member of the Turkish parliament. And Aykan, thanks for coming in and doing this. We appreciate it. That is interesting. The idea that because of domestic politics, he's going to go ahead and attack the Kurds in Syria.
We should remember, though, that the Kurds are not only relying on the United States for security, but also on Russia and President Bashar al-Assad.
Absolutely. Still ahead, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is ratcheting up his rhetoric about threats to U.S. interests across the Middle East from Iran. Pompeo is touring the region and lobbying leaders for even tougher actions against Iran.
Plus, Israeli forces arrest a Palestinian in connection with the murder of 2 Israeli soldiers in the West Bank back in December. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is touring the Middle East and trying to ratchet up the pressure on Iran.
Pompeo began his trip in Jordan and said that President Trump's decision to withdraw troops from Syria will not jeopardize U.S. efforts to counter Iranian threats and influence in Syria.
And you'll see in the coming days and weeks, we are redoubling not only our diplomatic but our commercial efforts to put real pressure on Iran to achieve what it is we set out for them back in May. These are simple asks. We ask of the Islamic Republic of Iran to behave like a normal nation, and the coalition is just as committed to it today as it was yesterday.
Last May, the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement. President Trump called it a bad deal and said it did not curb Iran's missile programs and terror funding as the United States had hoped that the deal would.
Meanwhile, an American Navy veteran has reportedly been held captive in Iran for 6 months.
The man's mother says that he went to the country to visit his girlfriend but never returned home. Correspondent Daniel Backus has that story.
46-year-old Michael White's mother says it was just 3 weeks ago that she learned her son, a Navy veteran, was in an Iranian prison apparently held there since July. According to White's mother, he was taken last summer while visiting his Iranian girlfriend. She says he has visited the country numerous times before, but when he failed to board his departure flight, she filed a missing persons report. This morning, the State Department released a statement saying, "We are aware of the detention of a U.S. citizen in Iran. We have no higher priority than the safety and security of U.S. citizens abroad," saying they have no additional information to provide at this time. White is not the only U.S. citizen being held in Iran. There are at least 3 others, 2 of Iranian descent, who are imprisoned in the country. Another American, Bob Levinson, has been missing for nearly a decade. News of White's disappearance comes at a time when tensions between Iran and the U.S. are growing. Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo starting a tour of the Middle East, meeting with U.S. allies in the region to coordinate an anti-Iran campaign.
Correspondent Dana Backus reporting there to discuss. Let's bring in criminal defense attorney Nicole DeBoard. And Nicole, the State Department would only confirm that they are aware of these reports. But if Michael White is indeed missing and detained maybe in Iran, what are the options? The United States does not have any diplomatic relations with Iran. What should the State Department do?
Right. I mean, this is an incredibly difficult situation. Iran is claiming that he has committed a crime. And so what I would do if I were this family is immediately get counsel here, criminal defense counsel here, who can interface potentially with legal counsel there in Iran and make sure that somebody from the State Department is constantly in communication with all of these individuals. Because this is really, even though this is being presented as a criminal charge or criminal allegation, it sounds like more of a hostage situation or potential political situation. So this is more than your average criminal defense situation, and they're going to need a lot of people to negotiate his release.
And Nicole, given Michael White's background in the U.S. military, was it foolish for him to go to Iran in the first place, as much as he might have wanted to see his girlfriend or personal reasons, but he had to have known that there could have been some problems?
It sounds like because he had gone there 4 times before without risk, he was lulled into a sense of safety, but it does seem like an obviously very risky situation. So, you know, if you are an American traveling to and from Iran right now with all of these tensions, there could be real risk, and I would expect the State Department to issue warnings, if they have not already, indicating that this is a dangerous place to be for these reasons.
So how does it work? Can Americans simply travel back and forth to Iran, go in and out the country?
Well, apparently not in this circumstance. And he had, on a number of occasions, had the appropriate visas and the appropriate permissions to go and return. But in this circumstance, even though he did what he had done before successfully at least 4 times, these same permissions did not work. And so this is something that he is now going to be dealing with for potentially a very lengthy period of time while people here in the United States try to negotiate for his freedom.
And Nicole, usually is it a good strategy for a family to raise awareness, to raise attention to this particular case while you're trying to engage in negotiations, or does that become counterproductive?
You know, it really can. It can be something that works both ways. It seems to me in this circumstance, without knowing a whole lot more about why he was detained, that the family is wise to draw attention to this circumstance so that he won't be forgotten and a lot of time won't be allowed to pass before the United States becomes involved and makes a decision about how or if they will become involved in getting him out of Iran.
Criminal defense attorney Nicole DeBorde. Nicole, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Israeli forces have arrested a Palestinian man accused in the fatal shooting of 2 Israeli soldiers.
That attack happened in December at a bus stop in the West Bank. I24NEWS correspondent Jonathan Regev has the latest.
A great relief is felt here by the residents of the West Bank, specifically here in the area of Givat Asaf, where that shooting incident took place just under a month ago, which left 2 Israeli soldiers there. And we can see this monument, the memorial here, just in the place where that attack took place, leaving 2 Israeli soldiers killed. Asim Barghouti, the man behind the attack, the shooter here at Givat Asaf, was apprehended by the Israeli security services this morning and is now was taken for further questioning. The fact that he is now in the hands of the security services does not mean anything regarding the level of preparedness here at the Givat Asaf junction. We're seeing armed soldiers basically in every corner of this junction, ready for any event that might happen. This is also the case at the Ofra junction, just a few minutes north of us, where a prior attack took place 2 days before the attack here in Givat Asaf. Asim Barghouti was also involved in that attack as well. And the soldiers that apprehended him this morning say he was preparing further attacks. Therefore, great relief from the fact that he is now in the hands of the security services. Jonathan Regev, I24NEWS.
Egyptian police are now blocking Palestinians in Gaza from entering Egypt. The move comes after the Palestinian Authority pulled its security personnel out of the Rafah border crossing, and Hamas officers took their place.
The Palestinian Authority accuses Hamas of undermining security operations in Gaza and, of course, throughout the West Bank as well. This is just the latest clash in a growing rift between the Palestinian Authority, which oversees the West Bank, and Hamas, a militant group that took control of the Gaza enclave more than a decade ago. Human rights groups say the Rafah crossing is the sole exit point from Gaza for the majority of its 2 million residents.
Meanwhile, Israel is blocking the transfer of more than $15 million in Qatari funds to Hamas. The money is supposed to help pay the salaries of civil servants in Gaza, but the Palestinian Authority stopped paying that money as part of its economic sanctions against Hamas.
Israel had hoped that the Qatari money for Hamas would ease the violence and the tensions along the Gaza border, but it has not. The tensions over Hamas could become an issue for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He faces elections in April, and his opponents and some supporters have accused Netanyahu of being too soft on Hamas.
To discuss all these events in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel, let's bring in Middle East analyst Thane Rosenbaum. Thane, with or without the delay, eventually the money from Qatar will make its way into Gaza and into the hands of Hamas. Israel's outgoing chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, he said today that it's Israel's interest that this money will get into Gaza. Can you explain why?
Of course. Look, Hamas likes to take the position that all Israelis are fair game. Civilians, soldiers, doesn't matter, all Jews. Israel should not take that position with Hamas. There's a civilian humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and anything Israel can do to relieve that suffering is important. In the end, Israel is going to be blamed if anything goes wrong. So if the Qataris are willing to pay the salaries that were being withheld by the Palestinian Authority. Remember, it wasn't just salaries. It was food, it was medicine, it was also electricity. So there really was and still remains a humanitarian crisis, and I think it's important that the Israelis demonstrate to the world that they certainly don't want the Palestinians to suffer more than necessary.
Even if some of the money or some of the aid is essentially part of corruption. In other words, it's not going to the intended places where it's supposed to, but nonetheless, that's really not Israel's ability to control or guide.
This is the Middle East, David. I mean, you know, it is an incredibly imperfect region of the world. And, you know, the kinds of moral standards that we would want to hold all nations to are not abided to in that part of the world. And so I think that, yes, Israel always faces this problem. Whatever, you know, if Israel reduces the blockade on Gaza, what do you have? Cement and missiles. and rockets, right? You could thinking, well, how come there isn't food and medicine? Well, there is food and medicine, but there's also cement and rockets.
So it's the third transfer of $15 million from Qatar. We're talking about $45 million in general. The Gaza Strip is about the size, I checked, of Detroit or Philadelphia, with a population of less than 2 million people. Put it in perspective for us. How much difference could this make?
Well, Tal, you know, today all throughout the United States there was reports about federal employees not receiving their salaries. And we were all reports all over about how American employees, federal government employees, are not going to during the shutdown. And so try to understand it that way. On very fundamental levels, people who are fulfilling civil servant positions throughout Gaza haven't been paid since the Palestinian Authority withheld those salaries.
Way more than 18 days.
Way more than, I like that. That's a good close to that, Tal. That's right. Way more than 18 days. So think about how long it has been, and the Qataris are willing to step in. This isn't even Israeli money. The Qataris are stepping in where the Palestinians have withheld the funds and let it flow.
We mentioned Egypt has closed the Rafah crossing, the main entry and exit point for people in Gaza to get out and go into Egypt. What do you make of what Egypt is up to as far as Gaza?
Look, you know, when Israel's blockade of Gaza, the siege and blockade of Gaza is a war crime. But look at Egypt. Right? They, too, see that these tensions between Fatah and Hamas are unworkable, unmanageable in every way. And they have their own border-crossing problems. So do
you think this is a pressure campaign that Egypt is putting on Hamas in Gaza?
Absolutely. They're saying, look, we certainly do not trust Hamas to police that border. How do we know that? Because we have to shut down the tunnels that were being built from Gaza into Egypt. So why would we allow the Hamas to be in charge of the border crossing? And we're going to shut it down until at least we can trust the Palestinian Authority. But look, you know, the only thing that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have in common, and the only thing they hate more than Israel, is each other. And this is, again, this ongoing problem. Yes, peace with the Palestinians, but the Palestinians don't even have peace among themselves.
Since we're talking so much about peace with the Palestinians and also money, I wanted to ask you about a report that came out in Israel over the weekend, and it's suggested that Israel will seek a $250 billion compensation for Jews who fled from Arab states, were forced out of them during the 50s, 60s, 70s, among them Morocco, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Yemen. Can Israel really expect that this will be a part of any future peace agreement with the Palestinians?
Tal, it's great to put it on the table. Probably nothing will come of it, but it's important to always remind the world that, yes, there were 800,000 Palestinians that fled from Israel after the War of 48. And guess what? There's 800,000 Jews who fled from Northern Africa and the Middle East. It's roughly the exact same period. They went to Israel, they went to France, they went to the United States, and no one wants to talk about that right of return. No one wants to talk about that restitution. So from a negotiating, from a leverage standpoint, even if you don't expect the restitution to ever be made, it's important, I think, to keep it on the table that there was displacement among Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews that came from Northern Africa and Middle East, and no one is talking about that, and certainly no one is thinking about restituting them.
Middle East analyst Thane Rosenbaum. And Thane, thanks as always for coming in. Good to see you.
Thank you both.
Still ahead here on Crossroads, it's been 18 days since the start of the government shutdown, and thousands of federal workers are about to miss a paycheck. The president is asking the public tonight to pressure Democrats to fund the border wall as a part of a government spending bill he wants.
And there was another drone sighting on this day at another London airport. The ground halt in Heathrow lasted for several hours, backing up flights and infuriating passengers. President Trump and Democratic leaders this evening are taking their battle over the border wall to primetime television.
The president is asking the American people to get involved as a government shutdown over funding for a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border is in its 18th day now, and negotiations appear to be going nowhere. Correspondent Kenneth Moten has the latest.
Days from the partial government shutdown being the longest in the nation's history, and President Trump is addressing the nation in his fight for southern border wall.
President Trump is prepared to do what's necessary to address what is a real humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border.
The president is considering a national emergency declaration. The executive action would almost certainly be challenged in court.
That President Trump is continuing to try to use this shutdown to extort funds for this non-necessary and nonsensical border wall.
Democratic lawmakers are working to pass more funding bills in the House and force a vote in the Senate to end the shutdown, impacting everyday Americans. The CEO of Food Share in Connecticut is sounding the alarm over funding for food stamps.
SNAP benefits will likely go away. Food for seniors, we don't know if it's going to exist next month. I mean, it's a very real problem, and if the shutdown does continue, it's absolutely going to affect the operations that we have.
The White House is recalling IRS employees to process tax refunds without pay. HUD is asking landlords not to evict tenants, and the TSA is trying to tamp down concerns over security. The union representing agents saying work without pay is nothing short of inhumane.
I'm not getting paid. I just bought a house. I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage.
That was Kenneth Moten reporting. Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. And Dan, what's the president's theme for tonight?
The president is trying to persuade the American people that there is a crisis on the Mexican border. As administration officials spoke in the hours before the president's speech, they said that he's actually feeling optimistic that the public is starting to agree with him, that he's been making the case that drug smugglers have been crossing the border, that terrorists could cross the border, even though Democrats and a lot of media reports say that the so-called statistics about thousands of terrorism suspects having gotten into the United States are misleading. The Trump administration apparently believes that by putting it in the framework of a presidential speech from the Oval Office, making it seem really important and serious, that would get through to more Americans. The Democrats, of course, realized that they had a challenge, but they were glad that the main entertainment and news networks in this country agreed also to broadcast a Democratic Party response. Tal and David.
And as a result, the debate this evening includes essentially both sides. Dan, what's the anticipation in Washington or expectation in terms of does any of this resolve or get resolved in the days ahead as a result of the dueling speeches this evening?
Right. You could wonder whether the speeches, in fact, reopen the government. Well, only in the following scenario, that President Trump is so effective that it's clear that he has public opinion. That puts pressure on the Democrats in Congress to go along with the Trump way of reopening the government, giving him the $5.7 billion he wants toward building a barrier, a fence, or a wall on the Mexican border. The Democrats say, no way, they're not going to fall for that. And the Democrats were confident they'd make their case to the people that it's a waste of money, that in effect it could even be a racist wall. So the stalemate appears to continue. And meantime, as we heard in Kenneth's report, there are 800,000 federal employees not getting paid. About half have to show up at work. The other half don't know when they'll go back to work, and none of them knows when will the next paycheck come. Tal and David?
Dan Raviv, our senior Washington correspondent. Dan, thank you. Let's bring in our senior national correspondent, Michael Schur. And Shu, as we start seeing more and more of these reports, whether it's food stamps or TSA agents who have to work and aren't getting paid, how is this going to cut politically over the next couple of days, assuming this doesn't get resolved immediately?
The Democrats are confident this is going to cut politically the same way that this cut politically in 2018, and that is that they were able to flip the Congress based on immigration in a lot of respects, also based on health care. But when it came to this issue, particularly, especially in the wake of family separation at the border, the Democrats are quite confident. One seat that they did not flip was Virginia's 5th District, and Virginia's 5th District is home to a lot of federal workers. It's also home to Denver Riggleman. Denver Riggleman's the new congressman from that district, and he, as a Republican, thinks that this is misguided and that there are priorities that the government should have.
So even Republicans
We're having these arguments about, too much money actually being pumped out of the federal government here, and yet they're adding money, like $54 billion for foreign aid, $12 billion more than President Trump actually asked for, and then they're arguing over .0011 of the entire budget. It just seems to me to be hypocritical and almost political theater.
That interview conducted by our colleagues in Tel Aviv at the Spin Room. It will air in its entirety, the interview with Denver Riggleman, on Spin Room Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. But again, you're seeing divisions in Congress, but the Democratic leadership is confident, and you'll hear that in their response.
And so Republican lawmakers, they're not giving the president, the White House, the full support at this point after 18 days as well?
Well, listen, I think right now they're giving deep-throated support when they are giving support. I think there are a lot of people who are quiet on the Republican side, waiting to see how it plays out. The president has pointed to poll numbers. Those poll numbers are scant. There haven't been many poll numbers, and the good ones for the president have come in states where he is already strong. So Republicans are looking at that, and they're looking to see what the fallout from a speech like tonight's speech will be.
Michael, we're seeing the president follow up to the speeches tonight by planning to go on Thursday to the U.S.-Mexico border to talk with some of the border police and, again, highlight the need for a wall. And yet there's some conservatives who say that this is a silly photo op for him to be doing, that he should not be going to the U.S.-Mexico border because, again, it seems insensitive to the government shutdown. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a good point. It's interesting to hear it coming from the conservative side. The conservatives are ones who have pushed the president to actually go ahead with the shutdown because they think too much money is being spent and not enough on this wall, many of them. So he's been egged on a lot by the Freedom Caucus, for example, that very conservative group of Republicans in the House of Representatives. That said, I think it's much ado about nothing. When a president makes a speech like a speech that the president gives tonight, you're going to see a follow-up to it. Usually they go on the road right after, similar to the State of the Union address. The most logical place for this president to go to make his point would be the border. So I don't know that his story is going to be well told there. Democrats were there yesterday in New Mexico. This is an ongoing story, but certainly this is a place for him to make his mark.
Michael, Dan Raviv told us beforehand that the president believes that the public is on his side day by day as the shutdown continues. But do we have any formal indication as of what the public really thinks?
No, that's what I was saying before, Tal. The polling has been really scant, and where that polling has shown up in places where the president is quite popular. So it would stand to figure that his immigration stance and his build the wall stance would be popular as well. I think this is going to be an enduring process because the longer that the government is shut down and the longer that it becomes the president's shutdown, if that is in fact how it is spun, then I think you're going to see his numbers falter. If they're able to put this on the Congress, then despite whatever people think about this, the idea of the wall, the president will probably prevail if he's able to solve this crisis.
And in terms of border security, immigration judges are among those who are not meeting right now because of the government shutdown. As those stories start to seep out into conservative media, that instead of catch and release, you have catch and indefinite release because people are missing their hearings and will have an extra couple of years to spend in the United States before the next one. Does that change anything in your estimation?
Well, yeah, I think it does, David. I mean, listen, these shutdowns are always so full of irony. The people that want to shut the government down are then the ones who see their legislative priorities undermined by the fact that there's no government to either curtail or allow these processes to happen. And this is case in point here. I mean, this is exactly why the Democrats are pointing to the fact that, listen, you guys want border security. We were giving you border security, and now you've shut the government down, and there's no border security, essentially. And that is a legal process, and the legal process has been stymied by the shutdown. If that endures, and if the shutdown endures, like so many other parts of the government, you're going to see this happen.
Michael Schur, our senior national correspondent, and Dan Raviv, our senior Washington correspondent, both, of course, key parts of our coverage of the president's speech and the Democratic response. Thank you. Tal, do you think that the speeches tonight will have any direct impact over the next few days?
Short answer, no. Do you think it's a smart idea for Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi to deliver their statement right after his speech?
Yeah, they're part of the mix. They're part of the debate, and I think it's wise. And again, the public is getting both sides this evening and hearing it all, and I think that's...
Public is getting good TV.
They're getting good TV. That's right. Just ahead, right here on Crossroads, we are going to take a closer look at one of the best basketball players in America. She was just suspended because of someone else's mistake. Welcome back to Crossroads. A reported drone sighting caused, well, some anxiety and anger for a lot of travelers on this day at London's Heathrow Airport, which is the busiest in Europe.
I was there. It is busy. Radar images show flights resuming after being halted for 1.5 hours. Airport officials say departing flights were suspended as a safety precaution. The police are still investigating the drone sighting, which was not confirmed.
Just before Christmas, drone sightings shut down London's other major airport, Gatwick, for 3 days and stranded more than 100,000 travelers there.
For more, let's bring in I24NEWS European correspondent Jonathan Satradoti from London. And Jonathan, it seems that now it's business as usual at the airport, but drones are giving British authorities a lot of headache these days. What are they doing to get to the bottom of this?
Well, that's right, Tal. Departures from the London airport were suspended for around an hour earlier today, with Scotland Yard saying that a full criminal investigation had been launched into the incident and that officers were among those who said they'd seen the drones. Thousands of people had their travel plans disrupted last month at Gatwick, as you said, when drones there were seen flying near the airport and all the flights were cancelled for some days in the run-up to the Christmas holidays. There's still no suspect arrested for that. The 2 people that were arrested were released after 36 hours of questioning. And while there has been a lot of talk of anti-drone technology being put in place at Gatwick and other UK airports, including possibly drone technology created by an Israeli company, it's not yet clear how that has managed to let drones in the Heathrow airport area, nor who could be behind these attacks. It could be the same people, it could be a copycat attack, but certainly this has highlighted a major flaw in British airport security when it's so easy to ground flights in major British airports.
And Jonathan, as you know, next week, drones and airport problems could seem like a small issue for the UK if the Brexit deal doesn't get a vote to pass in Parliament. What's the latest on Brexit? What can we expect to see?
Well, the original date, remember, for the vote on the Brexit deal that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, had come up with was meant to be December the 11th last year. She pulled that very shortly before then because she knew that she was going to lose in Parliament. So it was postponed, and now it's going to be reheld. There will be 4 days of debate starting tomorrow in the House of Commons, and then the vote will be held. People still predicting that she's likely to lose that because she just doesn't command a majority in the House of Commons anyway. And this is such a divisive issue, no matter which party is dealing with it. In fact, what we're seeing in the run-up are members of Parliament from across the board, from all parties, having conversations behind closed doors, forming alliances that would normally have been unthinkable in British politics, because on this issue, most MPs are very clear that the one thing they definitely don't want is a no-deal Brexit, one where Theresa May's deal is voted down, which looks likely to happen, but where there is no deal in place for when Britain does leave the European Union, because that date is set in stone. That date is set in law, and there will have to be some form of penalty, let's say, to the government if they're planning to push ahead with a no-deal Brexit. That's what members of Parliament are trying to do right now. And today was the first of such amendments where they've made it very clear that they're going to make Theresa May and the government's life very hard should they wish to pursue that no-deal Brexit.
So Brexit itself will only happen in March, but in the meantime, there's a new report from an accounting firm that shows that a lot of money is leaving the UK to the European Union. What numbers are we talking about, Jonathan?
Yes, Tal, EY has published a report which says that banks and other financial companies have shifted at least £800 billion, that's $1 trillion worth of assets, out of the country and into the European Union. And that's mostly made up of client cash and investments, such as stock and bond holdings. And they're moving that out of London before that 29th of March cut-off period when Britain officially leaves the EU. That's because there is uncertainty over what's going to happen once Britain leaves, because as we said just a moment ago, there's not any certainty at all about what the deal will look like or if there will be a deal. And of course, what business and finance wants most of all is certainty. Whatever's going to happen, they want to be able to plan ahead. EY also claims that the true number could be much higher because not all the firms have made public declarations yet, according to what they're going to do when Britain does leave the EU.
Jonathan Satradoti reporting from London. Jonathan, thank you. We've got an intriguing story that we were tracking tonight from Egypt. That country's Christian religious minority is celebrating a Christmas gift from President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi.
Coptic Christians, they make up roughly 10% of the Egyptian population. Correspondent Erica Jackson has more on el-Sisi's symbolic gesture.
A symbol of togetherness. As Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi opened up 2 places of worship the country's largest mosque, and the biggest cathedral in the region. The inauguration happening on the eve of Coptic Christmas, with the holiday celebrated by Copts, the Middle East's largest Christian minority. With Copts to hold a midnight mass in the newly opened Cathedral of Nativity a few hours after the event.
I consider this event to be exceptional. It is unprecedented throughout Islamic and Christian history. I have not previously seen or known of a mosque and church being simultaneously built and finished at the same time for the purpose of enhancing and protecting the mutual brotherhood and love between Muslims and Christians. I do not know that this has happened before, seeing these two shrines.
It was a message of tolerance after tragedy. The event taking place after a deadly bombing near a Coptic church in a suburb of Cairo unfolded over the weekend. It was a tragedy that hit Egypt less than 2 days before the country's Christians were getting ready to celebrate Coptic Christmas, and one which claimed the life of a police officer attempting to defuse the bomb. All in the country where for Coptic Christians, who make up about 10% of Egypt's population, violence is something they know all too well. The religious group facing a number of attacks in the country over recent years, including on Palm Sunday in 2017, when deadly blasts claimed by IS in 2 Coptic churches in Egypt killed at least 44 people. Besides not being protected, Coptic Christians also saying they face discrimination in the country, which makes Sisi's efforts all the more meaningful.
If we preserve our nations and keep them safe, we not only repair the damage, but we rebuild. We are building 14 new cities with mosques and churches and everything.
This Christmas, an event that symbolized oneness in Egypt. Erica Jackson, I24 News.
What a nice story, especially given the tensions and how much Coptic Christians have had to suffer with violence in Egypt. It's nice to see this act of unity.
And in general, Christians are persecuted around the Middle East. Yeah. It's nice that President Sisi does that.
Yeah. Back here in the United States, there's some new details this evening about federal charges against a Russian lawyer who 2 years ago met with members of the Trump campaign. Natalia Veselnitskaya, seen here in the audience during a congressional hearing, has been charged with obstruction of justice in a money laundering case, according to an unsealed indictment.
But the documents do not tie the Russian attorney to special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into election meddling by Russia.
Nonetheless, there's some new pressure, of course, that prosecutors here in New York could have over her, and they can take that evidence and give it to Mueller if they want. Let's turn now to Houston, Texas, where the family and community said their emotional goodbyes on this day to 7-year-old Jasmine Barnes. She was killed in a drive-by shooting.
As she was laid to rest, prosecutors announced charges against the second man allegedly involved. 24-year-old Larry D. Woodruff, seen here on the right, was charged with capital murder in her death. Police now believe the killing was a case of mistaken identity. Correspondent Linda Lopez reports.
Hundreds gathering at the Community of Faith Church in Houston for the funeral of Jasmine Barnes. Mourners streaming into the church to pay respects, a huge outpouring of community support.
I lost my son to son violence at the age of 18. You know, this year make me think about my child.
Just over a week ago, the 7-year-old was riding in a car with her family when a shooter opened fire, injuring her mother and fatally shooting Jasmine. Jasmine's mother, LaPortia Washington, emotional at her daughter's service.
Remember that I am with you every morning, noon, and night.
The family originally feared the shooting was racially motivated, the shooter described as a white man driving a red pickup truck. But a tip to police led the case in a completely different direction, police arresting Eric Black Jr., who confessed that he was involved in the shooting. A second suspect was then also taken into custody. Both have been charged with capital murder. Investigators believe the suspects mistakenly thought the Barnes' car belonged to someone they had gotten into a fight with at a club the night before. But today, mourners focusing on Jasmine and celebrating her life.
I didn't think it was going to be this big, but it is big and it is a celebration. And I just want to thank everybody.
Heartbreaking day, and that was Linda Lopez reporting. There is growing outrage here in the United States over the suspension of one of America's top girls' high school basketball players. The Alabama senior was banned for mistakenly receiving a payment for representing the United States in an international tournament.
Maori Davenport and her parents visited lawmakers today at the State House. Many of them are now joining the family, urging the State High School Athletic Association to reinstate her. Correspondent TJ Holmes has the story.
The Superstar Center, Maori Davenport, basically can write her own college check.
She is one of the best high school basketball players in the country. 6'4" forward Maori Davenport, a dominant post player who committed to Rutgers as a junior and helped the USA under-18 team win a gold medal this summer at the World Championships. But there's outrage after she was banned from playing the game she loves, suspended for her senior year at Alabama's Charles Henderson High School. Why? She was mistakenly sent a check for $857.20.
My parents called the coach to make sure that it was okay. He said yes. He said that everybody was going to get the check.
They said that she received the check and cashed the check and she wasn't supposed to. And so therefore she had broken the amateur rule.
USA Basketball routinely gives stipends to players for expenses, but failed to check with the High School Athletic Association in Davenport's home state of Alabama to make sure the payment is allowed. USA Basketball admits this was their error, and Davenport returned the money in full. But the Alabama State Athletic Association is standing by the suspension and tells ABC News its rules state, in part, a student cannot accept payment for loss of time or wages while participating in athletics as part of expenses. NBA giants are coming to her defense. Chris Paul tweeted, "How is this even fair? She shouldn't pay for someone else's mistake. This is crazy." DeMarcus Cousins, also from Alabama, tweeted, "This is wrong on so many levels that I don't know where to start. Fix this now."
Mary Davenport's been punished enough, and making her eligible now after a couple of months of their season would hurt no one.
I agree. I mean, it's not her problem.
And she
paid
gave
the money back.
Exactly, she gave back the money, so put her back on court.
I know it's TJ Holmes reporting. Officials in Alabama, man, they have some issues down there.
But with the public pressure from NBA stars,
Hopefully.
probably she'll see justice.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, dear viewers, feel free to vomit as I'm reading the next story to you. Utility workers in southwest England are weighing just how to tackle a giant blob of fat that's blocking the sewer system.
Authorities in the seaside town of Sidmouth say the fatberg is the length of 6 double-decker buses. Officials are begging residents to stop putting hot cooking grease, baby diapers, soiled diapers, of course, and wet wipes down their toilets.
They warn improper disposal could eventually cause the sewer to flood homes. Workers say it will take about 8 weeks to remove the mess.
Did I mention that it's not just fat that is mixed in with these diapers and the grease, that it's, yeah.
Exactly.
Finally, what would you do when a 1,000-pound dinner guest shows up uninvited? Well, that actually happened on Monday when a moose wandered into a hospital lobby in Anchorage, Alaska.
That's cute. Employee Stephanie Hupton, she captured a video of the animal nibbling on live decorative plants. Eventually, the moose triggered a motion-activated door and wandered back outside to nature.
Alaska officials estimate there are 175 to 200,000 moose throughout the state. But they only have just one on this day that decided to wander in the hospital. A lot of people found it amusing.
All right, that does it for
shame! Oh, the shame! Oh, the shame!
Stay with us for much more.